Welcome to SORA Pod. We are the Society of Reluctant Anthropologists, and this is our podcast. I'm Nayantara, and I will be joined by my co-hosts, Maureen and Sahil, to talk about the color of resilience for this very special American Anthropological Association annual conference episode. Now, just a really quick note, we accidentally used a few names, so you will hear some chickens, and that is where we have bleeped out names. Well, enjoy and join us. We are the Society of Reluctant Anthropologists.
So, for this episode, we are asking how can resistance and endurance be created through joy and aesthetics? Focusing on Sora.
Again, to give a little bit of context, SORA is not just a podcast, but our Ph.D. cohort, which is how the three of us met.
And it is open to anyone who would like to join.
That's right.
Now, SORA is worldwide.
So let's talk a little bit about the circumstances with which we began imagining this abstract. I mean, what we described in our abstract.
Facing certain difficulties, control, trauma by our department, we really came together in an act of solidarity as a cohort from being really atomized and not knowing that others are going through the same experience to realizing, hey, we're all in this together, and finding kind of various ways to fight back, for lack of a better term. That included lots of fun things. Help me out, guys.
It wasn't just fighting back. It was kind of like to keep on going
protection,
on.
Right? It was like
Right.
we were trying to protect ourselves and protect each other and be
self-motivate. like just because our only other option was to lay down and die, right? So seriously.
Which I feel like there are pictures of all of us in that state. Just like, I'm not ready to get up and do human things today.
So every Monday we would have a seminar where all of us, it was the one time in the week for that we would all be together. And once we started having to present on our own work, I think Maureen and I were the first people to go, and Maureen was just like, I don't want to do this or something. And basically, as a way to sort of facilitate being in headspace, we said, okay.
It's just like slightly important context to say, like, the first month or so being in that seminar, in that space, we realized how much of a space of like violence it was, right?
Yeah.
It's not because she felt uncomfortable around her work or she felt like insecure about her work or didn't like public speaking or we didn't know each other. It was that like that had already become such a space of violence of the department onto us that
that I was terrified.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I think for what I remember discussing, we knew that like not only would it be violent, but it would actually be counterproductive. Like it would not be helpful.
Yeah.
It would just be, every interaction that we would have would just be more like of a pain and a thorn in our side than actually trying to help us progress in our work. And so we decided that, all right, there will be a color, Maureen and I are choosing purple for this week's seminar, and I think a lot of people, almost everyone, showed up wearing purple. There were maybe one or two who thought, "Oh, this is just a game," but as Maureen, will describe, it opened that space for them to play, and it became this thing. So whoever was presenting at that week's seminar would choose a color, and the rest of the cohort.
There would be two presenters every seminar because the seminars were like 2 hours or so. Like it was long, right? And so there would be two presenters. So not only would someone just choose a color, but the two people who were presenting had to choose a color together and then let everyone else know. Do you know what I mean? So it was just like consensus based upon consensus based decisions.
And I think once you had somebody show up in your color, you were like, oh, this feels really good. And then you were on board.
Yes. Yeah. I think like it was really helpful. It was very helpful for all of us to look around and see like, everyone wearing not, and it's not that everyone could wear the same color, right? Like not everyone has like a bright purple t-shirt. We weren't asking for people to go out and do something, but like people would come and be like, oh, I have a little bit of purple on this logo on my
Yeah,
shirt. So that's why I wore
yeah.
it, and they would show like it was like, I'm gonna show you. I want you to know I am here for you. You might not be able to see it, but know that I'm wearing your color, right? We were all
I
going
guess.
through it. And I think it like brought out a lot of like weird creative impulses that we maybe didn't like work on just then, but I think as time has gone by, we've all like kind of come back to that space and like tried to like tap into that. I mean, this podcast is one of them, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
Let's talk about those creative impulses. Like we wrote that, you and I mean Nayantara and Maureen, for people who can't see us, we wrote this one sentence long description of each of the adventures of each of the members of the cohort.
It's sort of, yes, because it was sort of based on that Edward Gorey book, the I forget what it's called, but it's like an alphabet
ABC.
book.
the alphabet.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's called like the Tinicum something like that, I think. And so it's like little couplets, rhyming couplets for
Yes.
each letter. And we did that for every person in the original SORA, which was our PhD cohort. But it was so good. I remember, like, I read it again just like a few years ago, and it was so good. We were so creative.
But I think that's also, I know for all three of us, but definitely for other people in the cohort, and we've discussed this amongst ourselves, but like our writing was something that we were consistently being pushed back on.
Yeah,
And it
yeah, yeah.
wasn't, and surprisingly, Maureen and I think in some ways we're, similar about what we write, but we also have very different writing styles. And our advisor was telling both of us that our style was not correct. And because we were incorporating different things, writing in different ways, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
like actually when I think about like, this idea of like joy and creativity, one of the things that really stuck out to me was I completely thought I don't know how to write anymore because I was consistently just being broken down. And there are two instances where two different people, like all they did was they sat down and they like read something I wrote and they're like, this is beautiful. You wrote this really well. And it was just like that kind of expression of,
Mm-hmm.
they said it in this really joyful way to kind of be like, you should be happy about what you wrote.
Right.
So I mean, I think it wasn't just our own creativity, but it was also that like finding like reflecting that back to each other in a,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which I think we didn't get.
And I think
Yeah.
we needed writing because our intellectual and creative labor was so like unsupported yet overstructured. It was so bureaucratized.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we needed like these other creative outlets for writing. And so I think a lot of that was going on as well. But
Mm-hmm.
that writing also, it didn't stay on the page.
Mm-hmm.
Like we were reading these stories out loud to each other.
Yes.
We were writing them together. We were like cackling about them in the middle of the night. We
Yes.
were like, um,
We'd improv. We were, Maureen, you and I were kind of talking about this, but like improv and play and banter and how we talk to each other and connect with each other. And we really dove into each other's kind of imaginative space, which I think for me, one of the really important parts about this is if we had not sort of built this space to do that and we had not all bought into this idea that this was like the space that we're going to support each other and show care, we would not have been able to be on the same page because there's no way that all of our play, all of our imagination, all of our creativity would have looked or even intersected with each other. Do you know what I mean? Like there were people with very different sensibilities. There were people with very different ways of approaching these things. Like if we had just met and I was like, oh, we're going to do imaginative things together. There's no way that we would have been on the same page, but we like fostered a thing where we all just sort of like, we both decided we are going to be on the same page. And I think that's what's really
I
important
mean,
here. Well, I think sometimes I don't know why this is the image I have in my head about our cohort, but it's always a herd of zebras, right? Like very patterned, and it's the way that we like kept ourselves safe, right? Like they're all kind of different. Every zebra has different stripes, but like together they just ended up being enough to protect themselves, right? Because they were no longer individual zebras. That's what it is. That
And
predators can't see them individually.
I was thinking that like it wasn't, I mean, we had the fun creative exercises that we did, but do you remember that time we had a party at your house? And I don't even know how it got started, but somehow two cohort members started discussing taking the subway and how people would sit on the subway. I just remember I wandered into the kitchen
Mm,
and people were miming sitting on the subway in the
that's
kitchen.
very
They were taking
funny.
turns getting off and on and sitting up and down, and then they were trying out different methods, and it became this whole thing. And I that was sort of the moment that I was like, this cohort likes theater. Plus, it was so fun. I mean, I just wandered into it and didn't know what was going on, and then I became so intrigued. It stayed with me for like all these years.
Aw.
And
But I
actually, I remember I know that we were going from where I lived in Bethnal Green to your house, Nayantara, with a number of people.
Mhm.
And actually it was on I was gonna, it was on the whatever the district line or something. And for some reason we were transporting a rolling chair.
I'll tell you exactly why. That was the thing that came to my mind as well. Someone was getting rid of a rolling chair for free, or it was like £5 or something in Bethnal Green. And so I went up there, and obviously I don't have money for a taxi. So I said, "Hey, do you want to help me transport this all the way from one end of London to the other end of London,
Where was I?
potentially in Ohio?"
Oh,
But
okay, keep
no, no,
going.
this would have been the first year because I was living in Bethnal Green, so it would have been the first year. I
Mm,
have
I was at Lillian Penson then.
yeah, I
mhm.
have a memory that we met up with you later that night at Nine Tars, and I think and and me and Nine Tara
Yes,
were taking the underground from or the
With
district
the
line
rolling chair?
with a
with a rolling
rolling
chair.
chair.
What did the other people on the metro think?
So this is what I was gonna say. So we were a group with this rolling chair, and I remember, I was like, okay, there are not that many seats, so I will just sit on this rolling chair. And Nyantar, of course, was like, yeah, that makes total sense. And was sort of like, for a second, like, I'm just not gonna do it. And of course, was just like, um, no, this is like, what are you doing? And I remember there was this little girl who like was looking at me both with like kind of wonder and desire, but also with like incredulence and like horror. Um, and by the end of the ride, each one of us had sat on this rolling chair because it started off with being like, okay, I'm just gonna sit on this chair, and Antar was like, yeah, that makes total sense because you know there's a chair, and the other,
It's like the train is moving. It's also rolling around. So
and it's fun.
you're holding onto the poles on the subway, just like rolling around in this rolling chair. And
And
everyone, like, but even the other
just
people
for
on
our
the
listeners,
subway,
like it was in a space where it could be contained. It wasn't like we were just rolling up and down the car and hurting people.
no. It was definitely like just a little bit, like
Yeah,
right around where we were sitting.
yeah.
But like, other people also smiled as they walked by, right? Like, which also is nice. It's nice to bring a little bit of joy into a really dreary space. And the London Tube is like a really dreary space.
So I love this example. I'm so jealous that I wasn't part of this little adventure. But I love this example because it so basically what you needed to like there was something utilitarian about what
Mhm,
you needed to do. You needed to get a chair from one place to another. So you could have just done that, but then play happened along the way because why not?
mhm,
So and then the play sort of began, let's say, incidentally. Like you weren't like, I'm going to play right now. You just, it just
mhm.
happened. And then people who weren't at all in spaces you sort of got involved too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it just crystallizes exactly what we're talking about. And then the result was it changed the larger space.
Mm-hmm. Yes, actually, yes. I think it's interesting because so that, that was like a decade ago. And I think we're sort of in a context or a time now where people are more talking about play as adults and play in the everyday. And possibly it's like a generational shift, right? Like I'm a millennial, which apparently you guys are not. I don't know.
Who knows? I yeah.
And it feels like a generational shift as, us millennials are in our 30s and 40s. We're incorporating fun and aesthetics and play into how we engage in our everyday lives, right? Um, you see it with like a lot of these home decorating trends of like maximalism and like kind of fun poppy colors and that millennial pink that was around everywhere. Then we can also talk about colors, right? Just a few weeks ago, Barbenheimer happened and it was like a big deal. So I went with my friend, we did Barbenheimer. Barbie was great. I knew Barbie was going to be great. The experience of watching Barbie separately, even from the movie itself, was truly, I think it's what people keep going back to. It is the experience of watching Barbie because everyone in the theater was wearing shades of pink or like I saw people with like the t-shirts that said Barbie on them and like mothers and daughters were coming and everyone was in like their pink garb that created this atmosphere in the theater of that same sort of space of community and care. Like because people could show that they were here for the experience by wearing like pink and fun things and all of that, it like allowed everyone to sort of start to engage in this space and start building out this space. And yeah, it was a space for whatever it was, 2 hours, whatever the runtime was, but it was a really supportive space. And it struck me that this is what we had done by instituting colors back 10 years ago when we were a PhD cohort, that we all showed up in the same color as a signal to each other that we were a safe place. And that's what I really love about this Barbie movie. And I will say, one of the things that I'm really enjoying about all everything that's going on with the Barbie movie is that it wasn't just for opening day that everyone wore pink. People are going to see this movie multiple times going weeks later and they're still wearing pink to the Barbie movie because it's now part of that experience of creating a safe and supportive space.
And I went to see it because Nayantara told me it was amazing, and I was like, "Oh, whatever, I'm gonna go." And I went to a small art house theater. They had taken those, the cheap plastic tablecloths that you can get for parties.
Mm-hmm.
So they had taken pink ones of those and stapled them to all the walls so that everything was pink. And then
Oh,
hand built out of cardboard a Barbie box that you can stand in. I mean, during the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, and I forget what year that was. I'm sorry, guys. I remember, I mean, they had all kinds of things going on in Istanbul, all kinds of little protests, but the protests in the beginning were built on kind of theater and art. Like they had Standing Man, who was just standing there, and
mm-hmm.
standing in Turkish is diren, and it's the same word they use for resistance.
Mm.
So they were hashtag diren, hashtag standing. So he was standing. So, that wasn't lost on the viewer. And then the birds came and they sat on him because he was standing still for so long. And then there was this one picture where the birds had lined up beside them, and people were like, look, the birds are resisting. And what was happening sort of in the way that like an actual physical event happened, a man was standing there, and then a social media event happened which took on a life of its own, where
Mm-hmm.
this image, nobody knows why, really knows why the guy was standing there, but the image became an image of resistance. And then the birds definitely weren't, purposefully resisting, but they somehow joined, you know
I mean,
I
they
think
might be. The orcas are resisting. I feel like these animals are.
that's very true. I think I think that's what exactly what we're talking about is that these sort of multiple layers um, of how solidarity and resistance and actually conversation, nonverbal, like visual, symbolic conversation happens
Hmm.
um, right there. So let's see. I feel like we kind of veered away, far away. So let's turn back a little bit. And so I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about like kind of what we're seeing now in terms of solidarity and resistance, and then how what we were doing then fits with it or
Hmm.
doesn't.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I actually don't know a lot of this part of his work, but David Graeber does work on like resistance and carnival, right? So I actually don't know anything about it. So listener,
Well,
go read.
but I
Uh,
mean, like, oh, sorry.
oh no, I was just gonna say, like, I work with a lot of mostly like BIPOC, marginalized, progressive nonprofits, and a lot of those values now are around joy and like joyful community and solidarity, and doing this work with like kindness and doing this work in a way that is beautiful and brings happiness and brings joy. I'm going to use that word again. um and I feel like it's now so like mainstream, like we can talk to large philanthropic organizations and they understand the importance of that. They might not always fund it. But it is becoming part of like a mainstream conversation around uh resistance work, right? um Obviously I'm like very enmeshed in that world now, so like all of my knowledge is coming from there or Instagram. So
Yeah,
I can't really speak to anything else. But it is different from being in nonprofits 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Um
yeah. And
Which
I was gonna say, like, when you're mentioning that, Maureen, like similar to Nine Tower, like I think that there is a shift, and I'm not speaking necessarily from a professional place, but like, if I think about, I'm connected to a lot of like artists or mostly, minority, uh, POC people, and now like increasingly like younger, which I don't always realize that they don't see me as the same age, but they are younger. But what I think about, like, yeah, when we were doing the PhD, there was so much around the hustle,
mhm,
right? Like a lot of this discussion was like, how do you hustle? How do you monetize? How do you
mhm,
I'm thinking, the early 2010s, and maybe that's always been there to some extent. And at some point when I quit my job at the university, people were like, "Oh, you can turn your art into like, turn your Instagram into like a money thing." I was like, "No, no, this is like the one area that I don't feel any pressure, and I don't want
mhm,
this to be." But like I've noticed just in the last 2 years, or maybe since the pandemic, I don't know if it's, like because of the pandemic or something that happened, like there's, especially with these younger artists who are coming from maybe less advantaged backgrounds, there's like this very open discussion of like using rest
mhm.
as the point around which you build yourself, and using rest as resistance.
Yep.
So, and as a result of that, a recognition that the system doesn't allow you to rest. It is about the hustle. It is about,
Mhm.
but then, so people through either, WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, Instagram reels and stuff, saying like, hey, come and like let's all nap at my
Yeah.
place, or like, if you need a space to just zone out, like you can use, I'm not going to be in my apartment from whatever, whatever.
Right.
Rather than, I think like years ago, and I still see it, right? People are like, hey, I'm out of town. I'm looking to rent my place. Anyone, like, and so I think there's certain ways in which like it's not necessarily joy always. I mean, people really highlight that, especially in like, kind of queer circles, but rest, I see much more around people saying use rest as resistance to, the sort of like the capitalist grind or whatever.
Yeah. Shout out to the Not Ministry. Do you follow them on Instagram?
Mm-mm.
You should. I don't remember her name, but she has like a really cool book about like rest as a resistance. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Ah,
I'm really bad with names. So check out the Nap
go check
Ministry.
them out.
Yeah.
What's it called, sir?
The Nap Ministry,
Nap Ministry.
because no one wants to monetize their hobby. They don't want to monetize the thing that brings them pleasure because pleasure in capitalism is no longer pleasure.
What you guys are saying is making me think about like taking up space, which I didn't really realize was a form of resistance until one day Nayantara and I were talking about two customers who had come in the store, and I was working in a little Turkish shop at the time, and I'd offered them, a cup of coffee, as is the tradition, and they just really settled into the shop, and they were people of color, and I was just saying to Nayantara, like, I think it's so interesting how when I offer coffee to people of color, it kind of plays out differently than when I offer coffee to white people. And Nayantara said, well, that's taking up space. And and I thought about it, and later I came back to her and I was like, I had seen a meme and I said, you mean this kind of taking up space? And she's like, yeah. And then I was like, oh, resistance, like resistance to structural systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think um, that's sort of what we're getting at here, or what we're skirting around. Because you can take up space by napping, you can take up space through colors, you can take up space just by existing where you're not supposed to exist. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that and you can't take up space by being like, well, you can take up space by being still and silent, but like it's more about being you in the space, or creating a space in which you can be you.
I think
As
the difference is you can't inactive versus active, right? You can be still and silent and active. You can be still and silent and inactive,
There you
right?
go. Yeah, that makes sense. So, like, I think that's what we're talking about here, because the question isn't just about how people resist, but how they create solidarity and kind of a community of resistance. So maybe that's what we're talking about, is taking up space. So I want to talk about this for a second. We are definitely out of time, but I still don't want to talk about this. So something something that I think is very important to say is that when you do have solidarity and resistance, even if it is being done in an aesthetic way, the structural system, the moment it begins to feel pressure from that,
Mm-hmm.
as the moment the system is being asked to change itself, it pushes back, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
what they teach you if you study family therapy. The system
Yes.
always preserves itself.
Yeah.
So what happens is then you get people saying you're too loud, you're too vulgar, you're too violent, um, you're too rowdy. That's not actually aesthetic. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so maybe let's talk about that just for a little bit, and we can wrap up that way.
Yeah. I mean, kind of going back, I would like to actually take this back to our cohort. We were told we were unserious because we were doing these things, right? We were told we were unserious because we were showing up in similar colors. We were told we were unserious because we were bringing snacks for each other. We were told we were unserious because we spent time like connecting and going out for meals and blah, blah, blah. Like we were not serious academics because serious academics are always in competition with each other.
Mind
Right,
you,
Paul.
these were people telling us this through language, and I was more like,
Maureen
you
just fell over in her chair.
know, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it was the height of hypocrisy because it is people who are actually talking
work.
about this and working on this in their field sites and publishing papers and books and whatnot. But I actually
You
lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think also it wasn't just about being serious academics, right? It was also like when we did realize like, oh, this is not cool, and we did something, we were literally told, right, that this is not how you conduct yourself. The
You are bad
system,
children. You are rowdy
we
bad
were
children.
literally told the system cannot be wrong. Like those were the actual words.
Oh my
There's
god.
someone who writes about the system not being right.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I think this is what makes it so funny is anytime I relay this experience and then people are like, where'd you go? And like the punchline basically is I went to SOAS because
Yeah,
there's all these academics there who publicly would criticize any system that worked that way. And then internally, uh just support it and bolster it and protect it.
So, so how do we, as people who are part of systems, um, maintain, hold space for solidarity and resistance?
I co-lead this kind of religious like a community here with another person, and I think that like traditionally like Sufi structures are quite r- hierarchical and rigid, and even though we have a teacher and we have, I think like in our community here, like I sort of aim for it to, like to name and say like, look, it's not that I am like more knowledgeable or like enlightened or anything than anyone else. We're all coming here for a purpose, for in terms of like our spiritual growth or like whatever it is, and we're all making the space together. Maybe, yeah, I'm like, if it's on Zoom, like I'm opening the Zoom room and like leading things, or like someone, it's in someone's house, but like acknowledging that actually if each and every one of us weren't here at this particular time, this space would not
Mm.
be the way that it is. And I think for me it's a lot about naming and just being very honest about what is going on, and like recognizing both the structural issues and the humanity of everyone involved.
Listening to you talk, Sahil, also made me think that another thing that, well, Nayantara and I have talked about this a lot, like what I do in my work, what I can do, because I'm not the owner of a big company, you know what I mean?
Mm.
But what I can do is talk to like that person to person connection,
Mm.
which I think is what we're talking. I mean, that's what this whole podcast is about, that lack of atomization. So bringing people together, but when you can make that person to person connection and then advocate for them, for their betterment, like you're kind of, our voices together are stronger kind of thing.
Mhm.
And even though I don't have a lot of power, if I have a bit of power, my bit of power and your bit of power leveraged together makes more power.
Mhm.
And I think that that's also what's going on and what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is separate, but it strikes me as interesting that we are all consulting and like working on the peripheries of systems.
Yeah.
And, that's partially, I'm sure we were all primed to do that. We were all those types of people. But I also wonder how much our experiences in a large system has affected that choice that we've been making now for the last decade in how we want to work. For myself, I do come back to that PhD time, especially when I'm working with younger people of color. And like I say younger people, but now they're like in their 30s and younger, like not just straight out of college, like have 10 years of experience under their belt. Anyways, who do I want to be in their life? And I think Sahil, you were saying this too, right? Like I want to be the person that I needed then, and that was a
Yeah.
person who like had power and stability, and even if it wasn't the power of like the administration, it had these were people who had more power than me, who could have advocated, who could have helped, who could have supported. And I that's like a responsibility, that's a responsibility that I think all of us take very seriously.
Yeah. I think we're all nodding our heads. Like, I think
Mhm.
we're all making that choice to not do things the way that we have seen them be done.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
It'll also be open to, I think, and I think this is true for all of us, also be open to when people say, hey, this was not cool, because that's also something
Mhm.
we didn't get. And
Yeah.
I know individually each of us has like this experience of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from my perspective, what we talked about, I mean, this was great. I didn't expect the conversation to go like this. Like we started out talking about our cohort, talking about our imaginations, talking about how silly we all were, how much fun we had despite being in the depths of depression. And then we like showed we kind of showed our analytical skills. Like we showed ourselves as anthropologists, like how this experience has allowed us to see what other people are doing around us in the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
And then how we bring it back into our personal lives or our working lives or our religious lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I saw it.
Hope you enjoyed this very special AAA episode of the SORA Pod. We are the Society of Reluctant Anthropologists. If you enjoyed this, please check us out. We are on Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcasts. Or you want to check us out online, find out a little bit more about the podcast, find us at www.sorapod.com. SORAPOD.com. If you want to get in touch, maybe just drop us a line. You have an idea for a podcast, you want to be on a podcast, get in touch at hello@sorapod.com. The Society of Reluctant Anthropologists welcomes everyone. If you want to join, just tell people that you are a reluctant anthropologist. Enjoy the conference, enjoy Toronto. See ya.